So it is visualizing your digital archives ecosystem. And I'm a digital archivist at MIT. So what's in your fish tank? So part of the idea of this, right, is to figure out how do we know what is part of our digital archives ecosystem when we're doing our work, but also how do we explain that to other people, right? So how do you think about, and therefore how do you describe what your digital archives ecosystem is? So all the various pieces of things that are both sort of internal to the system, thinking about your fish tank, of what does it take to bring the oxygen in, who are the fish, what are the fish, you've got gravel at the bottom, do you have little fern things, are they plastic or not, do you switch them out, all those various things. So thinking about it in that way is sort of what I'm talking about here. So obviously language and messaging is one of the big parts that we're really dealing with when we're talking to our colleagues, when we're trying to get resources, when we're out talking to donors, as well as just sort of our local colleagues within our archives or our digital creation program, but also thinking about other people within our general organization more broadly. And so we know that when we use the language of standards, it can be really helpful because this sort of gives us that common base. So when I'm talking with Erica about what are you doing, this is what I'm doing, we do use words slightly differently in our own programs. And so going back to the idea of using the language we have from our standards can be a helpful way of trying to, in a more consistent way, talk about the types of functions and activities that we're calling out. So in the case that I'm going to show you, looking at Camus and using the language from Camus and OIS standards particularly was the way that I went about trying to map this type of stuff. And then other standards that we have, we've got other language like the records management standards as well, for which we can draw on. And that, acknowledging up front that defining your ecosystem is inherently a complex task, right? So there's a lot going on, obviously, if you're thinking of it as the whole ecosystem of everything and not just I'm going to describe a workflow to you. I mean, that's also a very complex type of thing you can do, but sort of trying to put it into the larger frame is what we're doing. And then this idea of layering that message as appropriate. So who are you talking to? What are you trying to explain to them? And when you've got your whole ecosystem, you need to figure out a way of being able to really show it to people sort of almost in slices and in pieces. So in breaking that down, if we think about those multi-layer books that you used to get, I was actually trying to find better images for this online, and it was almost impossible. So those books you used to get where they'd have the plastic film, and you sort of lift them up, right? That's kind of the idea of that little guy over there. So what's the skeletal structure? What's the basic thing we've got on that? And then you start layering on top of that. You've got your organs and your muscles, and then you've got your tissue, and then you've got the whole person, right? So thinking about as you're creating these diagrams or creating narrative, doing it in that way so that you can layer on things depending on the audience you're talking to and how complex you need to make it. So the basic layers being sort of your basics of content flow. Again, using in my case, using Camus and OIS, the ISO standards for the frame and the language that we're using. And then also assuming that the audience is in-house, but also is probably not really interested in the absolute specifics. So what I'm kind of trying to create is a communication tool, explain people basically what we're doing, but they're probably not terribly interested in the nitty-gritty of this. That's not what this description is trying to achieve. So we know Camus, or hopefully you know Camus. It's one of my favorite standards that we've got, and part of that is because it really helps with the whole donor negotiation, right? This is exactly how do we get our digital content in? This is the standard to use for that. So it has really great language around the various phases of first we talk to the donor and we need to figure out, what do you have? Do I agree with that's what I want? When are we going to do that? We schedule a session. We understand that session may be an iterative session. And then once I have what I have, then I tell you whether or not that's good enough, and then we sort of, from there, you move into OIS ingest, right? So using this language. So thinking about how do we then map that, however, to our local use and our local information. So we've got Camus on the top there, the complex OIS at the bottom, so all of the various features and activities, which is, again, these things are too much, right? We showed these to our donors. They're like, I don't even know what, I mean, not even that, which is pretty simple, really, quite frankly. But certainly not, the actual OIS reference model at the bottom there. And so, something like what I've put up there on the left, which I'll blow up for you in a minute, is it's Camus and OIS showing the producer and archives responsibilities. So that's what I was trying to get at from the beginning. Like, let's just really break it down into these very basic ideas and think about it. So we've got our language from RAS, the functional model here. And we can, we've got the bigger buckets of ingest and things and such and all, but we also know that there's things like messaging. So of all the functions and features and tasks that are in these standards, what are the things that are particularly important to get across when we're talking to donors in this case? So this was the first sort of that structural layer, the very basic layer of what I was trying to achieve originally, which was basically like we've got people, right? So I've got my little people up there. We've got both the archivist and the donor, and they're negotiating their submission agreement. And again, I'm calling out the language from the standards. So we've got negotiate submission, which you can use through a record schedule or a gift agreement. The data submission session, that's one of the terms in Camus, and I just love that because it's true. We have to actually schedule these things, right? We're not necessarily going into someone's closet, they're leaving the door open for us, and we're just boxing up the records and bringing them home, but you actually have to schedule this kind of thing. Do you have the password? What if, I can't just walk in your office probably and get on your computer, so how do we do these things? And that within that, there's scheduling the session, there's sharing our expectations, there's tying that to the submission agreement, which either could just be your policy or the fact that you actually have an agreement with people. And to plan the time for this iterative background. So, we've got a session, we've got some computers, we've got a calendar. When are we going to do this thing? And that then we sort of deal with the ingest. So then we sort of move over into OIAS. You have an ingest, we have expected data content objects. Again, pull on this language. And then the messaging over here, right? Send producer documentation of receipt. These are things that are called out in OIS, and being able to show that, for the producer, for the donor, and you're going to get an email from me to say, hey, yeah, look, I got it in. When I got back to my office, I was able to put these things on on our server, and now I'm going to start doing my work with this stuff. And then at the very end, hey, we got it, we've actually processed it now, so by the way, this stuff's actually been brought into the archives and it's all good to go. So again, just sort of what's the basics on this. But of course, there's more. Where does the data go? Where is it sort of living over time? What are we using in order to do that work? And isn't there a lot more than just those real basic buckets I was showing you? And of course, the answer is yes. So one of the challenges that we were having was people were sort of just saying, well, where do you store these data files? Of course, it's just in your storage space. It's like, well, actually, we have multiple storage spaces because they have different features and they have different security on them and they're doing different things. And we're actually moving them through our various storage services. So blocking those out and saying, right, when it first comes in, it's in submission. And then after we know what they are and we've accepted it, then we move it to ingest. We have archival storage as well, and then access storage is separate. So part of this is, again, looking at, we need resources, right? Because we need to say, we need more space, not just one big, large bucket space, but in fact, different spaces that have different characteristics. Then we detail more of the processes. So I just sort of breaking down what actually is happening within these things. There's more going on. And knowing that as we work through this, our processes are going to change, right? So how do you sort of create diagrams that, again, you're using the standard language to sort of bracket originally, these are the major functions we're doing, but also knowing that you're going to be evolving this type of thing going on. So what tools are you using? How do you place those in that context? How do you represent that? And then how can you map this into other types of processes in your organization? So in this case, I've added in the tools that we're using and where those tools are used throughout this process. And the thing that this is really trying to show is the iterative nature of this, right? So we use archive space in the beginning because we're going to create an accession and we have a collection, we're talking to a donor, we create agent records, we start to do some work. Then when we come over here and we start actually describing and arranging, we use archive space again. Over here, once we put stuff in archival storage, we have to update the records in archive space, right, to know now where's that digital content sitting. And then ideally, when we get to access, archive space is going to be one of the ways that we access the finding aid and the information about it. So also showing the fact that we're using these various tools and that they are used in multiple places throughout this process. Because again, we get asked, why do you need this tool if it's just for blah, 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 blah. And what we know in our work is that we use these things over and over and over again. So placing this ecosystem in context. One of the other things that's going on at MIT and Nancy McGovern is running is documenting out the content lifecycle. So the management of all of our content, whether it's physical, digitized, being transformed, or digital. So this part maps into, what I've done in the Institute Archives maps into the bottom rung, which is all about managing the digital content itself. So again, sort of how to how to expand out that part in an actual, in our case, this is what we're using particularly within the Institute Archives. So diagrammatic and narrative forms, these are tools that can help you in terms of the communication as you're talking back with people about the whole ecosystem. It's the tools, it's the storage, it's the people, and that illustrating how the tools fit in can also help with this idea that we evolve these things as the tools change. We distribute this information. We've got a blog, Engineering the Future of the Past, where we sort of describe this in more effort. And if you've looked at this at all, you'll notice that I've updated this document as it's gone through some iterative processes. And I'm interested in sort of feedback and other options of if anyone else has used this approach or other types of things. So see you around during the days. Thank you.
Thank you.